Hello, welcome to Podfic Galore. I'm your horrible online reader, Goldscythe. I read out loud fanfictions for you busy bees, free of charge and no strings attached. Today, I will continue reading the Silmarillion / Lord of the Rings fic by Bloodwing Blackbird from Archive of Our Own, called And Now Each Night I Count the Stars. I hope you can at least try to enjoy my voice, and I will try my best for you with the equipment available to me. Note, this fic is rated explicit concerning this chapter. On with the show. And now each night I count the stars. Chapter 15. The second time Michael visited the buzzard's nest, he was admitted through the front door, not the servants' entrance in the alleyway. He had liked it better the first time. The buzzard lived well, particularly by the standards of these later days when supplies coming to the city were often interrupted by attack. Michael should have been curious about it, for he liked to know where power lay, especially the hidden sword that this man clearly wielded, but he couldn't summon any more than the dull sort of wariness. A servant took his spear, and another led him through the airy rooms full of filtered sunlight and tapestries faded to soft colors, and settled him in a plush chair with a glass of wine and his back to the door. When she left, going out of the room without meeting his eyes, Michael drained his glass and refilled it. The buzzard was a broad man, but not tall, shouldered twice the width of Maglor's, though the top of his balding head reached only to Maglor's chin. It was easy enough to see that he had been a fighter in his youth, even without the broken nose, the boxer's ear. There was a fluidity to his movements, a cat-like lightness to his step, that said that he was still not somewhat cross, a little hint of grim humor. Maglor might almost have liked him, if he were not going to be indebted to him. "Still don't have a name, I assume," the buzzard said from the doorway. "No more than you do," replied Maglor, standing and stretching. "Come on, then. I've got what you asked for." Maglor followed him to the parlor through the narrow hallway and down a flight of stairs. As they descended, the mortared and plastered stone above gave way to raw rock of the hillside. In a cool room, lined with shelves of unlabeled crates and barrels of wine, the buzzard pulled out a heavy chest. "Take a look." Maglor lifted the lid to the rust, shit, rotten smell of battlefield and pulled out a helmet. Dented, poorly made, it would hide his face. Beneath he found a pair of thick leather pauldrons, a corselet of iron and leather, gashed and stiff with old blood, and a heavy cloak on indeterminate color that smelled and felt as if it had been buried with an orc, then unearthed and burned with another. All of it was ugly and poorly made, and none of it would fit him properly. In short, it was perfect. Maglor pulled out the cloak and began to bundle the rest of it within. "Eager, are you? Even garbage isn't free in this town. I'm sure you've noticed." Maglor sighed and straightened. "I have no coin." The buzzard's pale blue eyes glinted at him, creasing at the corners in a fashion that was almost friendly. "Sure you do. I deal in many things, you realize. Information being one of them." "I have nothing to sell you there. This is a private errand." "Shame." He took a step back and looked close. "I also collect experiences, you might say. I don't think I've ever had one quite like you." "No." "Shame," the buzzard said again, and closed the chest. "A lot of effort gone to waste. For you only to toddle off in the dark lands. An elf anyone with half an eye can spot 6 miles off." Maglor clenched his fists. There were other ways. Safer ways. Smarter ways. But he was here, and he wanted it over. It wouldn't be worth it. It wouldn't make a difference. But maybe it would convince him of everything he had already left behind. Of all the choices he could make. "What do you want?" The buzzard smiled, and Maglor didn't much like him anymore. "Nothing so terrible. Just a tumble. Friendly. Easy. I'll even make it nice for you." "I'd rather you didn't," said Maglor, reaching for the buckle of his belt. The buzzard smiled and quirked an eyebrow. "Oh, we can take our time. The cellar is not where I meant to do this." "I'm going to need more wine." After, the buzzard tried to touch his shoulder, but it was too much. He had already been touched everywhere. Big fingers firm on his thighs, his chest. stick a seed between his legs. He flinched away. To his credit, the buzzard pulled his hand back. I didn't mean it to be that bad for you. It doesn't matter. He had still asked it, and Michael had let him. It was nothing he hadn't done before, after all. It should not have mattered. You said you didn't have any coin. He sat up beside Makler and tugged at his hair, a smile like he wanted Makler to forgive him. Makler thought he would be sick. He shoved to his feet, pulling on small clothes and breeches. His knife. Why hadn't the buzzard taken his knife? He pulled it from the sheath and watched the man's eyes narrow, then go wild when Makler turned it on himself, sawing through the thin braid. Here. He threw it at him, the length of dark hair, a little copper coin that should have been stained green, would have, but that Makler touched it so much, rubbing it bright. Now you've got it all. Can I go? In the morning, he shouldered the clanging, stinking bundle and left by the gate, falling in with a group of farmers returning to their fields after a market day, scaring their horses with the smell of blood. He kept to the road, passing again beyond the Ramos Ekor. He would have avoided Osgiliath if he could have, but the garrison was kept there, led by the sons of Stuart no less, if the gossips of Minas Tirith were to be believed, but there was no other way to cross the river without travelling many miles out of his way, bar swimming. The Anduin was steep and treacherous in these parts, though, and Makler wasn't particularly inclined to put more effort than necessary into this project. He waited until the night was full, hiding in the scrubby woods along the riverbank, before he entered the city of Osgiliath. Minas Tirith had fallen far from its glory, yes, but Osgiliath was unrecognizable. Empty streets filled with stones tumbled from walls, roofs collapsing upon themselves. Even the rats seemed to have fled. Makler moved from shadow to shadow as easily as he were part of them, always listening for signs of the men who were garrisoned there, but nothing moved within the deserted streets, not until he got close to the river. From the tavern gossip, Makler had learned that the bridge had been rebuilt. Maybe the desolation of West Osgiliath had lowered his expectations. But as he slouched his way down the bluff overlooking the river, he had to admit that the river crossing might not be as simple matter as he had experienced. The bridge had been fully rebuilt, grand as it had ever been, great blocks of white stone that leapt across the roaring river in graceful arches. If he had wondered where the vaunted garrison was, he wondered no more. At the base of the bridge was a camp, orderly rows of tents lining the shores of the river, with regular patrols marching across the wide white avenue of the bridge. On the far shore, he could see more torches, another similar encampment. Perhaps the military might of Gondor was not as spent force as he had thought. He forced the door of an abandoned home, drifting through the dusty rooms like a ghost. It had somehow remained largely untouched, but for a corner where the roof had leaked and fallen in, showing stars through the hole. There were crocks in the kitchen, honey gone to crystal, floor full of weevils, a jug of wine. Makler pulled the cork and took a swallow, then spat vinegar onto the floor. He perched in the window of the home for many hours, watching the patrols, carving a deep gash into the windowsill with the point of his knife. He saw the men of Gondor's army walk in patrols on the bridge, watching as a party of men rode in from the north, clad in green and brown. His halberd would have been well and home among them. He shoved that thought aside, looking for a gap, a changing of the guard that he could take advantage of, but he saw nothing, for everyone who approached the bridge did so with their face exposed and even, and so they were stopped and questioned, often showing a token or slips of parchment that were unrolled and read. He would see that none passed the bridge without their purpose being known. Would they grant him passage? He didn't know enough of these men to know whether they would believe him. If they did, would they let him pass? It seemed unlikely, which left him two options: subterfuge or mischief. The plan he settled on was a pleasant combination of the two. Under the cover of dark, it was easy enough to sneak into the outskirts of the camp. For all their watchfulness, it was plain that they did not expect attack come from the west. On that side of the camp were the cook fires, the horses, the wagons that supplied the garrison. He crawled beneath the fencing around the paddock, singing softly to the horses, below the hearing of men, but loud enough for the gentle ears of the beasts, and they did not stir as he passed among them. On the other side of the paddock, he walked behind the row of tents, listening for any sounds of approach. From his observation, he had learned that the patrols only came this way hourly, but that did not mean that he could relax his guard. He tried several tents before he found one that had anything useful: an oil lamp, a bow, a quiver, and a green cloak of the kind favored by the riders he had seen coming in from the outside of the city. Quickly he shut the black woolen cloak with the deep hood that had served him so well, and traded it for the green hood of the rangers. His beloved straw hat had been already left behind in Minas Tirith, traded for a sack full of hazelnuts for the market girl with a sprig of holly in her hair. He took the bow and arrow from the quiver, then used his knife to cut a long strip of fabric of his cloak, which he wrapped around the head of the arrow. Muckler stood the wrapped arrow up in the lamp to soak in the oil as he took up his burden again. These preparations made, he squared his shoulders and sauntered from the tent. In the darkness, none gave him a second look, though he did receive a few stiff nods, which he returned. In this way he reached the shore unquestioned. At the edge of the river there were watch-fires burning in the great iron braziers. Many of them were ringed about men warming their hands, talking about the sorts of things that soldiers talked about when there was no fighting to be done. Muckler walked past these to a fire that had no company, and there he watched. He stared at the far shore for a long time, choosing a target with care, for burning the whole Skileth garrison seemed too high a price for a passage of the river, even for Muckler. He found it, though, a tent within the range of his arrow, but far away enough from the others that the fire would not spread before it could be extinguished. He lit his arrow and let fly. As soon as the arrow left the string, he dropped the bow and walked away, not running, not watching to see where his shot landed, just strolling, as casually as he could. He had almost reached the bridge when the shouts started, and he was passed by men running across the river, rushing to control the flames. Muckler went with them, dashing across the bridge with the other soldiers, his bundle clanking on his shoulder and humming a tuneless, repetitive little song beneath his breath. When the soldiers turned south towards the blaze, Muckler continued east. The city on this side of the river was even more ruinous than on the west, for it had only been recaptured from the enemy a few decades earlier. Despite this, it was more populous, with patrols passing through desolate streets with greater frequency, even with the distraction of the fire. Muckler spent as much time as he could in the shadows, or leaping from rooftop to rooftop to avoid them. There were some sharp-eyed men among them, including the one who had stood on the street below Muckler for many minutes, staring almost precisely at his hiding place with sharp grey eyes. Muckler stayed hidden where he was for a long time after that. The eastern wall of Osgiliath was again well watched, but it had been built to keep things out, not in. Muckler slipped through the warring of streets until he found an alley that dead-ended the wall. He tossed his burden over the wall, wincing at the sound as it clattered onto the ground below, then set about climbing the wide stone. Even after centuries of neglect, the stone still fit together with barely a gap for a fingerhold. A leap to a roof with his spear for help, and then a vault to the top of the wall solved this. Atop the wall, he paused and looked back, just in time for the sharp-eyed man who had so nearly discovered him to come careening into the alley, sword in hand. He stopped short and stared, for Muckler's stolen hood had fallen back, and the moon had stirred himself from behind his cloud. He knew that he could not be mistaken for a man in this light. He could see the fellow's throat work as he swallowed. Muckler thought that he would raise the alarm, but instead he sheathed his sword and gave Muckler a sharp nod. He touched his fingers to his brow and tipped himself over the wall. Nothing moved in the flat place between the two cities, and Muckler paused at the great crossroads. Beneath the stone figure of a long-dead king, he set his bundle down and shed the Green Ranger's hood and put on a heavy shirt of metal rings and leather and buckled the pauldrons to his shoulders. The stuff was heavy, inept, the sort of things made quick and without thought of grace or comfort. Its joint dug sharply into his shoulders where none had bothered to file the raw edges. The helm made his head hurt. Whoever had made this had taken no joy in its creation, which was a little to be wondered at. Over all that he pulled the reeking cloak. It was often strange to Muckler how garments could change his bearing, The way he had always stood a little bit taller in the armor than his father had made, a little bit prouder, even when he went to do the deeds that would stain his very soul. Already, he found himself slouching, neck thrust forward and jaw clenched, his steps heavy. He had told Saruman that there was no special art to walking unnoticed, and this had been mostly true. Much of it was in knowing when to hide and when to pretend that he had nothing to hide. The rest was in bearing, in presentation. Most were eager to see what they expected to see, and would do so as long as Makler only offered no evidence that would cause them to question. This did not hold up for prolonged scrutiny, of course. None who looked at his face for long would believe him to be anything other than what he was. His task was to make sure that none felt a reason to give him more than a passing glance. If there were some small art beyond that, of singing of sorts of songs that bored the listener, that burrowed into the brain and told them that there was nothing interesting here, well, Magdalene was content for Saruman to remain ignorant of it. As he had said, though, none of it would work on those who knew how to look closely. If he encountered any powers greater than orcs, they would know him. Minas Ithil, as Maklar had last seen it, had been a bright city. A little shimmering bird cradled between the hands of the dark mountains, its plumage all of banners and flags. The lands about had been fair in their own way, seasonally flooded marshlands where a riot of waterfowl called to each other and flowers bloomed all summer long, full of beavers and egrets and fishermen, the latter two vying about the bounty of the little pools and streams. At night, the city caught the light of the moon in its marble walls and the tower of the moon overlooking all. No longer. Minas Morgul stood somehow untouched by the clean light of the moon. It was luminous itself, glowing with a foul light that spoke of rot and of deep places beneath the sea. There are some lights that confuse the eye, that come from strange directions, that flatten vistas, lights that emanate from the very stones themselves, lights that somehow only make it darker. This was the tainted light of Minas Morgul. The land around the city glowed, but the water that flowed sluggish through the veil was black and oily. The very plants, round with sparks of corpse light, seemed sickly, for only a few scraggly things could grow in such a land. A few brave willows and reeds were preyed upon by the unwholesome parasites, choking them until the whole became a tangled, festering mass. There was a smell about the place that was like the sweet meat reek of a dead thing, but also like the scent of a rotten cabbage. The Tower of the Moon, at the end of his journey, was still there. Its black windows yawned in the foul effulgence, and it slowly turned to and fro as if it knew of his approach and awaited him. The sun would rise soon, and though the reek of Mordor would hide the dawn, this place was too exposed, and Maklar could not linger. He hurried along the road, seeking speed more than subtlety, until he reached the once white walls of the city. There he waited, crouched in the muck beside the causeway until a company of orcs passed. He rose smoothly and fell into step with them, thus passing into Minas Morgul. Within the walls of the city, the scent of drowned lands grew stronger. It smelled of foul mold, and each breath felt tainted, as he could feel the rot taking root, starting to grow within his very lungs. He choked and spat, which would perhaps have attracted attention had he been in other company, but the orcs made enough noise on their own as they jostled around him. He stayed with them until he found a landmark that he knew in the changed city, a courtyard on the third level with a fountain at its center. This had been the home of a spectacularly corrupt nobleman to whom Michael had once sold his services, running a speech or two, singing a song where it might enhance his reputation, small tasks like that, all while helping himself to several fine pieces of jewelry and the nobleman's bored wife. It was as fond a memory as Michael could bear to consider in this place. The fountain had now been defiled, the marble porpoises now encrusted with slimy growth, and the basin choked with fetid ooze. Michael slipped away from the troop there and passed into the villa. Within, the rooms bore the same marks of corruption as he saw them throughout the city. Everything porous was filled with mold, and great clouds of the spores assailed his lungs with every step across the warped and swollen floorboards. He found the scullery and thence the trapdoor that led to the tunnels. Makler did not know the history of their construction. It need not have been a nefarious purpose. Perhaps a way to leave the city in secret in event of an invasion. Perhaps a way for servants to move about unseen. Regardless, by the time Makler had come to the city, they were used only by those whose dealings would wither in the sunlight, himself among them. Most importantly for his current expedition, these passages swept throughout the city, eventually leading all the way to the topmost circle of the city. Makler lifted the door and scanned the walls within the tunnel. They bore the same noxious growths as the rest of the city, and he could see the foul symbols scrawled upon the walls by the orcs who must have used tunnels to escape what daylight still reached through the reeking haze that shrouded the Morgul Vale. He descended cautiously, but though he could hear harsh voices ahead, he met no immediate challenge. A feeling of sickness grew upon him as he walked, as if the thing that had been planted in his lungs and was writhing there, awaiting its chance to burst forth from his throat. Around the bend in the passageway he came upon them, only 5 or 6, gathered around a small fire that smelled of dung and roasting meat that smelled as it had been dead for a long time. "Gar," said one, "shove off, you! This hall's full enough already." It spat a great gob of phlegm at Makler's feet, but had no time to say anything else. A tunnel was no place for a spearman, but Makler did well enough with his knife and his teeth, and soon enough he was left with 6 dead orcs, one of whom had fallen upon the fire and was beginning to smolder. He kicked the body aside and continued on his way. The operation was repeated, theme and variations, several times before he reached the upper circles of the city. As he rose, he found there to be less and less obstacles to his passage. Clearly those that held the tower did not encourage their servants' ascent to such heights. Indeed, by the time Makler emerged from his burrow in what had once been a wine cellar of yet another grand estate, the silence had begun to grate upon his ears, and his head ached from the scent of sorcery. He stumbled a few steps, dizzy, a sudden vertiginous feeling gripping his stomach. He swayed and fell to his knees, retching and shaking. Finally, he steadied himself and rose to his feet, using his spear as a support, and he faced the tower that loomed above him. Its window stared out with the blank menace of a corpse, and he could feel the spell swirling around him, like wading through a school of fish. He tried to find a song, to call the music into his heart, but it would not come to him, and he had quite forgotten what it was to hope. When he forced himself onward, it was at the call of something else altogether. Through the open door at the door of the tower it called him, and up the long stairs of black stone that wrapped around the inside of the spire, narrowing with every step. He stumbled as he climbed, and his vision grew black at the edges, but still he climbed, and he could not say whether it had taken him days or only hours to near the top. The Chamber of the Moon must have once been fair, but like the rest of the city, it festered, sticking up rot, as if a river had somehow soaked into its walls. The marble of the floor was chipped, and within the cracks you could see pale things writhing. The walls had been hung with tapestries, but these were now blackened. Whether with flame or with corruption was now impossible to say, and the evil stories told themselves within their threads. And evil stories told themselves within their threads. At the center of the room was a great plinth of black stone with something atop it, covered with a heavy black cloth that sparkled, shot through with golden thread, the only fair thing he had seen in, had it been years? There was no sound in the chamber, as if the whole tower held its breath. Makler understood that he was betrayed, entrapped even before he touched the cloth. It slid aside, heavy and rich, with a sound like the sea. The thing beneath it was dead glass. His father's creation would have flashed with life, with fire, but this stared, sullen and damning. Around him there was a sound, a breath that the city had held, and his approach exhaled all at once. Makler turned back to the staircase, but it was gone, the floor of chipped marble uninterrupted. He stamped, bashed at the tiles with the butt of his spear, clawed at the floor, fingertips bleeding, the pale things beneath the floor writhing in ecstasy. There was no way out. Not that way, but there were windows. And it was no secret that it was better to die than to find oneself in the hands of the enemy. He went to one of these and looked out over the city spinning slowly beneath him. No breath of clean air reached him, not even this high. He swayed there for an instant, and then leapt. He fell for a long time through thick darkness that clung to him, that slowed his fall, and then deposited him, almost gently, beside the plinth. He ran then, from window to window, launching himself through their empty eyes as if he could somehow outrun the enchantment, until he lost count of how many times he had left the room, only to find himself again at its center, the blank eye of the glass orb mocking him. At last, he sank to his knees beside it, and waited. He could not say how long it had been. The window showed no sign of time's passage. After an eternal second, he heard something beyond the room, above the room, beneath the room, another breath that was somehow the sound of all the creeping corruption that held the city in its grasp, breathing as one, all of its attention at last focused on him. He should have stood, should have prepared himself. He should have found something to fight against, something solid to push against. He could not move. Muggler had sunken, without noticing, into the floor itself. Now the broken tiles held fast to his legs, and written things between the cracks rose up, a wave of slimy, crawling things that climbed over his body and pulled him down. He closed his eyes and tried not to breathe, but they overwhelmed him, seeking ways in anywhere they could find them, eyes, nose. They climbed into his ears, and it hurt. It hurt, and he could not hear. He screamed then. They filled his mouth so that he choked on their rotting flesh. They bore him down, into the darkness, and he knew no more. End of chapter 15. Stay tuned.